How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical.
Hello, you are listening or watching DNA Today. We are a genetics podcast and radio show. I'm your host, Kira Dineen. I am a certified genetic counselor practicing in the prenatal space. On this show, we explore genetics' impact on our health through conversations with leaders in genetics, experts like genetic counselors, researchers, doctors, and patient advocates. My guest today is Janice L. She is the director of the Masters of Science in Genetic Counseling program at Bay Path University, and she's also the author of Brooke's Promise, a novel that we're going to be diving into on this episode. Thank you so much, Janice, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And for people watching on YouTube, this is a copy of Brooke's Promise that I just finished reading. And we're going to be talking about the contents of the book and the genetic counseling aspects to it, because I don't read a lot of books that even mention genetic counselors, let alone have sessions in the book, which I was very excited by. But I'm spoiling it a little bit. So what is Brooke's Promise about for those that maybe haven't heard of the book yet?
Right. Well, Brooke's Promise, against all odds, is a hopeful story about changing expectations, forgiveness, reconciliation. It's about putting your life back together after learning your past is a lie. Through dreams and flashbacks, we learn that one of the main characters, whose name is Julia, had been assaulted 30 years ago at summer camp when she was 15 and has no memory of it at all. And now she's older, married, has a couple of children, and her son Ryan, who's grown up and married, pushes his wife into a pregnancy she's not sure she's ready to have. And they have a beautiful baby girl who has failure to thrive. And when they take her for a number of medical evaluations, they find that she has a diagnosis of a devastating hereditary disease. And in the background of all of that, Kira his wife is a defense attorney who was hired to defend a college kid accused of acquaintance rape. His case, as well as Kira's pregnancy, helped to restore Julia's memories, which ends up revealing a world of secrets that threatens to unravel the entire family. So, they're all forced to uncover these truths that they don't want to face and discover a past that's going to have life-altering consequences for all of them.
The practice of genomic counseling and variant interpretation is advancing at an incredible pace. The University of British Columbia offers an online, flexible graduate certificate for genetic professionals who want to keep up. You will learn to apply the latest methods in clinical bioinformatics, variant interpretation, and genomic counseling. It's an ideal way to earn CEUs while enhancing your genetic counseling practice. Learn more via the link in the show notes for this episode or at dnapodcast.com. It's time to defend our title as the best 2020 science and medicine podcast. The podcast award nominations start July 1st, 2021, so we need you listeners to get DNA Today nominated at podcastawards.com. Last year, we were against very popular podcasts, and because of the support we had from you, we ended up winning. So to win again, we need all of you to nominate DNA Today in the science and medicine category. So head over to podcastawards.com, and again, select DNA Today for the science and medicine category. Pause the show now. I swear it takes 30 seconds to do it. Thank you so much. So it certainly is a lot of storylines that all kind of line up and end up coming together in different ways. And just have to say that the main character, you have the couple, but one of the characters is named Kira. So that might be confusing during this interview. When I saw that, I was like, oh, look at that. I don't see the name Kira come up a lot. You spell it with a Y, so a little bit differently. Right. But what inspired you to sit down and write this novel? Is this something you've been thinking about for a while? Was this something more related to just recently in life of saying, you know what, I'm going to sit down and write a book with genetic counselors?
It's funny. A lot of people ask me that, and it's not something that I had always dreamed of doing and finally found the time for. It just kind of came to me one day. One of my favorite authors is Jodi Picoult, who, as many of you probably know, wrote a book called My Sister's Keeper, in which she tackled the issue of a couple having a baby for the specific purpose of being a stem cell donor to save her sister. And the ethical dilemmas in that really struck me. And I've actually used that book for book groups with my students. And then my other favorite author is Lisa Genova, who uses the PhD that she has in neuroscience to make neurologic disorders like Alzheimer's and Huntington's disease accessible to everyone. Her books, Still Alice and Inside the O'Briens and others, really bring these neurologic disorders to life, but in fiction, in a way that it's accessible. And in fact, on her website, it says that she writes stories that are equally inspired by neuroscience and the human spirit. And so a couple of years ago, it occurred to me that I could do the same for genetic disorders. So you know as well as I do that people expect genetics to be really complicated and assume that they're not going to be able to understand the details. I wanted to make those details accessible and real to the person reading a fiction story. So in Brooke's Promise, the genetic disorder is a metabolic disease in baby Brooke. And I have another novel coming out soon where I'm exploring a hereditary cancer syndrome in an adult.
And it's great because in this novel, Brooke's Promise, you can go through like the fertility side of things, a little bit of the prenatal and then the pediatric. And then it sounds like with the other book, you're covering cancer. So you got like the 3-4-ish main areas there of genetic counseling.
Don't leave anything out.
Right. Which you might have to write a lot of books if you're going to include all the specialties, but maybe that's a challenge I'm giving you there. So the first genetic counselor they meet with is a fertility genetic counselor. What is discussed in this session? I mean, it's a scene in the book. Do we say scenes for books? I think we do. I don't know. But, it's a chapter. It's a part of, going through like, meeting with the fertility genetic counselor. What's the type of content that's covered in that? Maybe for people that are listening that are like, I didn't even know genetic counselors work in fertility. What does that look like?
And so that's what Ryan and Kira said to each other is, what is a genetic counselor? Why are we here? They made an appointment with a fertility clinic because naturally they were having trouble conceiving. I don't know why else you would. And they didn't even know they were seeing the genetic counselor. So, we always experience that with our patients. So I thought that was important to bring up. And so they meet with this genetic counselor who tells them that every couple exploring the option of assisted reproductive technologies in their clinic anyway, meets with a genetic counselor in order to review the couple's medical histories to determine whether there might be any signs of why they're having trouble conceiving and what risks there might be to a baby due to things like maternal illness, medication exposure, anything that the parents might pass on to the child. It's also to discuss how the couple might feel if they discovered that one or the other was infertile and might need to utilize a sperm or egg donor to conceive the pregnancy, and all the emotional ramifications and physical logistics of how that all works. She explains that there are many ways to achieve a pregnancy and offers them carrier screening to provide some extra security for having a healthy baby, or at least that's what they go into it thinking.
Right. And so for part of that, they're looking at the fertility treatment options. And there's, some people think, oh, you just go in, you do IVF, but there's a lot of different options when it comes to it. And one of them is IUI that they were like focused on. What is IUI for people that don't know of that?
It's intrauterine insemination. So, depending upon what type of fertility issues people are experiencing, there are different processes that can be used. And Kira and Ryan decide to start with artificial insemination or intrauterine insemination because it's one of the simpler treatments and is often the first step for couples with unexplained infertility. So if that hadn't worked, perhaps they would have gone to the next somewhat more complicated procedure, but they didn't actually need to.
Right. And sometimes it can take a couple rounds of doing that, which we also kind of see and experience there, which I thought was really great that it's, you see that things are not as straightforward as some people think of like, oh, you just, one day you just try and then you're pregnant. And that's not always how it happens.
We also want to show how that affects people psychologically. It can be devastating, particularly for people who've been trying for a really long time, finally to not get their acts together, but, finally to make the big decision to go for fertility treatments, and then it doesn't necessarily work right away. And that can be a major setback psychologically, and even for a marriage, it can be really challenging.
Yeah, and we get to see that play out in Brooke's Promise with just the relationship between Ryan and Kira and the conversations they have, especially with other family members and how they're taking in that information of, we're doing fertility treatments and, how does everybody feel about that? And, what are their perspectives on it? How much do they understand about it? And I think it's cool that you also see Ryan and Kira learning from the genetic counselors this, but then, Kira talks to her parents and says, okay, I'm reiterating this to you. And that's something that, as genetic counselors were sitting there, we're like, okay, do you have what you need to tell, say, your partner that's not there, other family members? But then we actually get to see it play out in characters, which is really cool, because for genetic counselors, we don't see that part. We don't see people in their homes explaining it.
Right. And we hand them materials to share with their families, and we don't know if they ever do it. And so Kira did.
And then if we fast forward to, as we've been saying, baby Brooke has failure to thrive, which is a kind of general-ish term. What are some of the signs or symptoms when a baby has failure to thrive?
Right. So like you said, it's really an umbrella term to describe inadequate growth or the inability to maintain growth, which usually occurs in early childhood. It can be a sign of undernutrition, and it may be caused by medical problems or factors in the child's environment, such as abuse or neglect, or in this case, genetic disease. Those that are biological may involve genetic factors, such as chromosome abnormalities like Down syndrome, or single gene disorders, such as those involved with metabolism, as we see in Brooke.
And so one of the conditions as they're going through and meeting with is it a pediatric genetic counselor at that point, right? A pediatric genetic counselor and a geneticist at different points. So part of the workup with that is they're coming up with different conditions that could be there. So one of those is called Pompe disease. For those that maybe aren't familiar with Pompe disease, I know we've been talking about metabolic conditions. Can you break down what that means?
Sure. Pompe disease is what's called a glycogen storage disorder. It happens when the body can't make a protein that breaks down a complex sugar called glycogen for energy. So too much sugar builds up and damages the muscles and the organs. So it causes muscle weakness and trouble breathing, and in more severe cases, a whole host of other problems that mostly affect the liver, heart, and muscles, and depending upon the type, can be very serious.
If you're interested in a career in genetics, I highly recommend checking out KGI's Master in Human Genetics and Genetic Counseling program in Claremont, California. KGI emphasizes interprofessional collaboration, systematic problem solving, the safe, efficient, and ethical uses of biotechnology, and personalized patient care. This is all accomplished through a variety of experiences, including rigorous didactic coursework, clinical training, research preparation, and supplementary activities such as case conferences, grand rounds, journal clubs, and seminars. The KGI program has established affiliations with multiple genetic centers throughout Southern California, which offer access to tremendous resources for clinical, industry, and laboratory experiences, and provide a culturally dynamic and enriching environment for genetic counseling students. KGI is dedicated to the education of innovative genetic counselor who will serve the needs of individual patients, the healthcare system, and the bioscience industry. You can learn more about the program at kgi.edu/DNA Today. Again, that's kgi.edu/DNA Today. Did you know there's a genetic counselor that specializes in offering care to those in the adoptee community? Brianne Kirkpatrick co-wrote the DNA Guide for Adoptees to provide a resource for those in the adoptee community, especially those who are utilizing DNA testing to find biological relatives or seek out medical information. She also started Watershed DNA to offer personalized genetic counseling to directly support people in the aftermath of a surprise DNA discovery. You can hear Brianne share her insight from her book in episode 103 of DNA Today. Learn more at watersheddna.com, where you can also book your consult today with Brianne. And when it came to figuring out what disorders you were going to explore in terms of what the characters were facing, what led you towards Pompe disease? Was there any experience in genetic counseling that led to that?
No, actually, not my own personal genetic counseling or in my work. It's actually a pretty funny story. I had initially written it as a different metabolic disorder, which is really unexcitingly named maple syrup urine disease, because when a child is affected with this, the urine tends to smell like maple syrup, and that has to do with the metabolites that are building up in the urine. And when my son was an infant, I noticed that his diapers sometimes smelled like maple syrup. And of course, he was absolutely fine. But as a genetic counselor, I know it's a real disease. And, I just kind of had to make sure. And my son has always been laughing at me that I was just using my genetics knowledge to make up something ridiculous.
We know a lot, so we're looking for things in family members. Yeah.
Always. So I was going to use that disorder in the book as an homage to my son. But then I realized that maple syrup urine disease would have been picked up on a newborn screening panel, so that the fact that Brooke hadn't been diagnosed with it right away wasn't particularly realistic. So at that point I said, okay, I need to change this to something that would work. And then I had to think about newborn screening panels and what they detect and what they don't. And Pompe was one of those that wasn't commonly put on the newborn screening panel, at least, a few years ago when I was writing the book. And then, so I changed the whole thing to Pompe. And then in some of my research, I discovered that there is now enzyme replacement therapy for Pompe. And I thought, oh, that changes everything again. I'm not rewriting this. So then it hit me. All I had to do was set it back 10 years and it worked.
I did notice that. And then I started Googling. I was like, and it takes place in Vermont, right?
Right. So I wasn't on newborn screening in Vermont.
Right. Yes, because I was like, well, I'm not familiar with the Vermont newborn screening. I practice in Connecticut, and then, went to school in New York. So that's what I'm used to. And I was like, well, maybe it's not on there. I'm like, I'm going to have to ask Janice because, I'm going to look at the details. I'm going to be what's going on?
It's true because, generally people write about what they know. So, if you read a John Grisham book, his books are always set in Memphis or somewhere in the South. That's what he knows. And Jodi Picoult sets her books in New Hampshire or that area because that's what she knows. So, I'm from New Jersey. I could have said it here, but then it wouldn't have worked. So,
and you had to fact check it. It had to be legit. So the other thing I was thinking about during this was, Kira and Ryan met with a fertility genetic counselor. We mentioned that earlier. Part of their workup was carrier screening. That's very standard if someone is having fertility treatments that, all right, let's cover the carrier screening that way. If we find that a couple is a carrier of the same condition, that there's a risk to a pregnancy, that they have the option of choosing embryos that didn't inherit that disorder. So I'm kind of thinking, okay, their carrier screening came back negative. So how is it they could have a child with an inherited genetic condition? Like where is almost the loophole, for lack of a better term, in terms of having that negative carrier screening?
It's a fair question. And Kira and Ryan asked that question as well. And in fact, Ryan
highlighted in the book. I was like, Ryan and I are on the same page here.
Yeah. He's saying maybe there's a lawsuit going on here. I think he's just reaching for anything that will help him cope with the situation. But the fact of the matter is the carrier screening is not foolproof. And that's not necessarily because it has errors. It's because it doesn't include everything. We can't put everything on a carrier screening panel. There are thousands of different disorders. So, much like each year, a group of scientists decides which particular flu viruses should be included in a flu vaccine. It's kind of the same thing, except that it doesn't change too much year to year. But, the ones that are deemed more common and severe as newborn illnesses go are the ones that are included. And there are thousands of different ones. So deciding what to do takes some finesse. So carrier screening panels cover, like I said, the more likely genetic conditions, but can't cover all of them. So, and some of the ones that are more likely to occur in certain populations, such as Tay-Sachs disease and those of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, are ordered for those couples where that applies. And so we see for Kira that they added the Jewish genetic panel onto her testing because she's adopted and she doesn't know what her ethnic background is. So to say there's guesswork involved is not really fair. It's definitely much more intentional than what guesswork sounds like, but there are definitely things that are not involved in the panel, and Pompe disease is, generally speaking, one of them because it's very rare. And
it's possible too, if it was on the panel, that they could have a more rare mutation and that it's just not covered on the panel, especially if I'm thinking the book takes place around 2008. Is that right? Kind of in that time zone. So time zone in that area that back then, maybe we weren't sequencing genes as much as now we're kind of leaning towards. So if that was,
Right.
you know, 13 years ago, I wasn't practicing 13 years ago, but I imagine that we weren't sequencing as much, and it was more
Right.
of looking at the hot spots on genes. Okay, is there any problems here, and not reading through the whole gene?
Exactly right. Yep. It's the same way we used to do genetic testing for, you know, people who are already living with different kinds of disorders. You know, you could test for them in some way, but you couldn't necessarily rule out all of the mutations that could be possible. And if you couldn't, then you couldn't offer testing to the rest of the family because you didn't know what you were looking for.
Right. Yeah. You have to have like what you're testing for to be able to test other people. And something you mentioned earlier was talking about like the enzyme replacement therapy. That's more of a recent treatment for people that have Pompe disease. You know, during this, Kira goes to like a conference to learn more about Pompe disease, which I think is such a cool aspect that was included in the book, of just the patient advocacy side, and that patient advocates like are such a big part of like the medical community in terms of, you know, helping with their own, you know, children or whoever they're caring for, but also just like adding to knowledge we have and educating others. What resources are there for parents seeking support of maybe if they have a child with a rare disorder? Is there anything that, like, as a genetic counselor over the years, that has been resources that you found to be really helpful?
Sure. Yeah, there are many different types of advocacy groups. Some are condition specific and focus on one rare condition or a group of closely related conditions. So whether it's Pompe disease or it's glycogen storage disorders or it's metabolic disorders, you can keep increasing your scope, I guess. Some may focus on providing support or driving research, while others offer a whole range of services like helping to find a doctor or organizing conferences or working to gain the support of local, state, or federal legislators. Some are more umbrella groups or alliances in which advocacy groups may join together to tackle larger issues, maybe like advocating for legislation to help or protect all individuals with rare and genetic conditions. A couple of good examples include the National Organization for Rare Disorders, which we sometimes call NORD, and the Genetic Alliance. So while these groups may also provide information and resources for specific medical conditions, their activities and resources tend to be focused more on helping the rare disease community at large. And then, of course, there are just general support groups that focus on a particular symptom that may have different causes or on a part of the body or a body system. These groups tend to offer more general information and resources, and sometimes just a place to talk through your feelings on the subjects.
Yeah, definitely. And NORD is such a great resource. The headquarters is actually in Danbury, Connecticut, for people that are Connecticut based. So close to my hometown there. I did an internship with them when I was younger, but they're such a fantastic resource. And I find that even when you're searching conditions on there, they really phrase information very nicely in terms of giving you like a complete picture, but phrasing it in layman's terms so that anybody can read it. So I find that that's just a great resource, and that they link out to so many other like patient organizations and like those smaller chapters that you were kind of referring to. Right. So there's certainly so many different resources there. And then, you know, once we're back to in-person conferences and like that being, you know, more involved in terms of like meeting other people, the rare disorder patient advocates we've had on the show so far have talked about just how embracing and impactful it can be to meet with other parents of children with, you know, the same or similar disorder. Have you heard this from patients over the years? Is that kind of what influenced the book a little bit in terms of like those interactions between parents?
I can't say that's what influenced the book to begin with, but it's certainly what made me want to put it in there once I started writing the story. And for people who are reading it, for whom the whole subject matter may resonate, I think it's going to be important for them to see that these resources exist and how to access them, and that there are these big conferences that can involve both the research scientists and the patients, and further out than that, even there's the medical personnel that help with patients, and there's the parents and the siblings, and there's so much out there, and it's a big village to take care of these children who really need the care.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think in the digital age too, it's just so much easier to connect with people, especially around the world. Has DNA testing turned your life upside down? Genetic counseling can help. Just as the novel Brooke's Promise explores multiple areas of genetic counseling, so does Watershed DNA. Brianne Kirkpatrick is the founder of Watershed DNA, where she offers her years of expertise to help people process the emotions and family dynamics around genetic test results. For people seeking DNA testing, Brianne can help people choose the right DNA test. For those that have already done a test, she can review genetic results. Brianne guides people uncovering a situation of not parent expected, coaches those preparing to share a DNA secret, and assists those attempting to search for biological family members to find the right path forward. And here's a bonus. You can hear today's guest, Janice Berliner, on Watershed DNA's podcast called DNA Clarity and Support Podcast. You can listen in your favorite podcast player by searching DNA Clarity and Support Podcast, or you can go directly to watersheddna.com, where again, you can also book a consult with Brianne and learn more about all the ways Watershed DNA can support you and your family. Again, that's watersheddna.com. Preparing for a career in genetic counseling? Check out Keck Graduate Institute in Claremont, California. At KGI, you will gain the training and development to become an innovative, collaborative, and caring genetic counselor. KGI prepares graduates to be leaders among healthcare professionals dedicated to the delivery of advanced, personally optimized patient care and the translation of applied and clinical science breakthrough to enhance the quality of life. So if you want to be a genetic counselor, check out KGI at kgi.edu/DNA today. Again, that's kgi.edu/DNA today. Going back to Ryan and Kira and all of their experiences, a twist in the book that I wasn't expecting is that they're found to be related, and we're going to leave it vague so that people read the book and everything. But right when, I found this out, I was like, wow, should we be concerned about other conditions other than Pompe disease? If they're looking at having other kids, Pompe disease is going to be one of a conversation. Will they have another child with Pompe disease? Having that conversation with, their genetic counselor. But what about other conditions?
Right. It's true. So many just genetic disorders, especially those that are detected with carrier and newborn screening, are inherited in a recessive fashion, which means that they have to be inherited from both parents in order for the child to be at risk. If the baby only inherits it from one parent, he or she will be a carrier like the parent, but won't be affected with the condition that we're talking about. If a couple's related to each other, then there's an increased chance that each of them has inherited the same recessive gene alteration from a common ancestor. So, we all have abnormal recessive genes. We generally speaking don't know about it because the only time it affects us is if we have a child with somebody else who has the same genetic disorder as a recessive trait, and it's passed on by both parents in the same pregnancy. And so luckily that doesn't happen all that often, which is why something like Pompe is so rare. But so it's not because they had a baby with Pompe that we're worried about other conditions. It's more that the same mechanism that caused the recessive inheritance that resulted in Pompe in Brooke could be at work with other genes that they might have in common because of their shared family history, and therefore could put another child at risk for Pompe, for something else, or for both even.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And just that, maybe not all of us, that's a bit of a statement, but most of us are a carrier of some condition. I mean, there's hundreds of conditions that are inherited in this autosomal recessive way that you explained. So, if this is one of them, are there other conditions that they're both a carrier of because they share some kind of common ancestor, as you said? So certainly another thing to be thinking about, and I don't know if this will pop up, if there's going to be a sequel or anything else on the horizon there. I have to ask, right?
Well, you are not the first person to have asked about a sequel. So I'm going to say quite possibly. I've written an outline for it, but I haven't started it yet because there were other things I've been wanting to do in the meantime. So decided to write another story first. This one is entitled In Good Conscience and is the story of a famous actor who develops a serious illness. I mentioned before, it's a cancer. And in the course of his treatment, loses the love of his life. His private information is leaked for the world to see, and he faces his mortality, of course, much sooner than he ever would have imagined. Meanwhile, one of the nurses where he's being treated is grappling with whether to reveal some information that she knows about him. Doing so could save some lives, but would go against everything she was ever taught about patient confidentiality. So it's kind of a patient confidentiality versus duty to warn kind of story. And as she struggles with that inner turmoil and her guilt, she ends up forging a delicate relationship with the main character, the cancer patient, which ultimately kind of redeems both of them. And they get through it together, which is maybe all I'll say about that one for now.
Yes, no, it sounds fantastic. If you would like to enhance your genetic counseling practice, don't forget to check out the University of British Columbia's Graduate Certificate in Genomic Counseling and Variant Interpretation. The program has 4 courses, which are each 13 weeks long. They are fully online and flexible, so they can fit in with any time zone or schedule. NSGC has also approved each individual course for 3.9 CEUs. That's almost 4 CEUs per course. Learn more via the link in the show notes for this episode or at dnapodcast.com.
Don't forget to help us defend our Best 2020 Science and Medicine podcast title. Go to podcastawards.com and select DNA Today in the Science and Medicine category. Here's a bonus. If you tweet or post that you nominated DNA Today, then we will share your post and give you a shout out on the show as a thank you. Again, that's podcastawards.com. DNA Today for the Science and Medicine category. You have the power to get DNA Today nominated again and hopefully win again. So please nominate us now at podcastawards.com, Science and Medicine category.
For people that want to read Brooke's Promise, because that's available now, we are teaming up for a giveaway. So you can head over to our social media. Just search DNA Today on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and connect with us and enter to win a copy of, again, for people watching our YouTube video here, Brooke's Promise. Again, you can win your own copy by heading over to our social media there. But if people can't wait to see if they win the giveaway, where can they just buy the book and have it shipped right to them?
Right. It's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble, it's on Goodreads, and it's on my website, which I would love for you to check out at janiceberliner.com. And on the website, you'll find a great deal of information about Brooke's Promise, of course, as well as about me and a good number of blog postings I've written and a couple of podcasts that I've done prior to this one. And I will very shortly be adding details about In Good Conscience there as well.
Yeah, so all of the information is there, and we're going to link to that in the show notes to this episode, available at dnapodcast.com, along with our other 150 episodes that we have. So definitely feel free to watch and listen to all of those. A lot of the episodes are about genetic counseling, since that's, you know, the field that I've decided to pursue. And so we've had a lot of genetic counselors on the show here, like Janice. And so if you have any questions for myself or Janice, feel free to email in info at dnapodcast.com. And one quick favor before we end the show, if everybody could take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, we'd really appreciate that. And if you read Brooke's Promise, then do Janice a favor and leave a rating on Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, one of them, all of them. That is the way to help authors out for people that aren't aware. Reviews are very important. Yes, so thank you so much, Janice, for coming on and just nerding out with me about a genetic counseling book, because there's not a whole lot of them out there. So it's like a very small shelf that I've started now.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening or watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, are all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA.